All right, I am going to jump right into this and start sharing my screen. Hi, everyone. To those of you that I know, hello. To those of you that I don't know, it's nice to meet you. So, one second, let me just share my screen. I've prepared a short presentation for you all. I'm going to talk for about a half an hour, and then I look forward to chatting with you all in the Q&A. But as Christian was saying, I would like for this to be really informal talk. Like if you have something that you would like to talk about, discuss, feel free to drop it into the chat and we can talk about it during the Q&A, but I'm also not going to be offended if you feel the need to interrupt me in the middle of a sentence. I'm absolutely fine with that too, okay? One more thing about the presentation. And so if you were going to ask questions, put them in the chat so we can discuss them later. I've got all of the slides numbered so that you can use those as reference points if you want to talk about something specific or ask a question about a particular piece or a particular thought. So my name is Jonathan Sangster. I am a artist, designer, and educator. Well, right off the bat, I'm going to tell you that, some members of the design community might call me a heretic or a liar because when I say artist and designer, I mean both. In my work, in my art practice, in my design practice, and in my education practice, I do not feel the need to delineate or make a strict separation between who I am as an artist and who I am as a designer. So in the things that I make, I don't feel the need to draw a strict line between what's art and what's design. I mean, obviously that's going to be, a little bit more muddy if you're doing, work for your firm or your agency or your client. So when I'm talking about all of these things, I'm talking, from my perspective, right? So I'm just going to start at the top because in terms of, right, the work that I make and experimentation, all except one of the things that I'm going to show you today are for my personal practice, and these are all self-initiated projects. So this is typically the beginning of the work for me, right? Like all of my work is influenced by, right, something going on in my life, right? The world, current events. A lot of it comes from literature. I read a lot, and this is where all of that material that I use for inspiration ends up, right? Whether it's thoughts, questions, ideas. I mean, often in these notebooks that I keep, there are far more questions than there are answers. But I think that that is something that is essential to my process as well. In my work and in terms of experimentation, even if you're looking at like a project that would be defined as quote unquote finished, like it's more like the visual representation of a question in response to another question. Right, so literature is a very strong influence in my practice. And just like I have an art practice and a design practice, I have a reading practice as well. And this is where a lot of my thoughts and concepts come from. And it is, right, even if the work that I make isn't about a specific thing or a response to a specific book, chapter, sentence, like all of these things become part of the synthesis that then later leads to the visual communication of something. And I'll also just take a moment to point out that in these stacks and stacks of books that I have, the stacks of books that I have read, the stacks of books that I have not yet read, they are not, right, in the 2 slides that I'm showing you right now of these books, there are none that are about design. Right? It is one of my beliefs that design is a tool, right? A tool to communicate. I do not believe that design is about design, right? Design is always about communicating something else in the outside world, right? Some other message, some other thought, some other perspective, right? And the only way that I find that I can find fuel for my work or perspectives or thoughts and theories is by, bringing the world to me by reading about it. If you all want to talk about the books more specifically later, just let me know and we absolutely can. I could talk about books all day long. So in terms of experimentation in design, and I'm probably going to stop referring to it that way because, for me, that muddles the language when I'm trying to determine how to talk about something in terms of art or design. I'm probably just going to refer to it as my work or your work, right? So in experimentation, the work that we're doing, right, as makers, you have to find out like what inspires you, right? This isn't something that someone else can tell you. Someone else can't help you develop your perspective. They can't determine what's important for you to care about. These are things that you have to focus on before you even start thinking about, right, experimenting with something, right? If you don't have a perspective, if you don't know what you're trying to say or what the ideas that you're trying to visually communicate are, right, then it's like, not only what's the point, but it's like, then it's not really your work, it's somebody else's. And in terms of experimentation, it should always be about you, whether that's about pursuing a different idea, like branching out, like trying to develop a new skill. Like all of these things are going to be deeply personal to you as a maker. So this first piece or collection of posters that I'm going to show you is the only one in this presentation that is not a self-initiated project. So KT Duffy, who teaches at NEIU, is a fantastic coder, technologist, and designer. And she approached me with the idea of creating posters that they were working on with a colleague of theirs for a book that they wrote, right, called the Transcode Manifesto, which is fantastically interesting to me. I'm not going to go into deep depths about what the book is about, but it's all about technology, coding, and how the ideas of coding are inherently trans. Right. So I'm working on this project and I'm thinking to myself, right, like what that means and how to bridge the two ideas. Right. So one of the things that I was thinking about was how to include themes of one, connection, and two, translation. Right. A lot of my work is very type heavy. So working with the idea of translation and connection ended up going 12 different directions. I'm only showing you 3 iterations, but the important idea to me was to try to grasp this idea of the organic and the inorganic, right? Blending human aspects with technological aspects. The experimentation had a lot to do with a schematic that they sent over for a device that they use in coding. And I decided to visually break that down and try to blend the language, blend the type, and blend the imagery in a way that could be defined as techno-organic. And so in my work, when I'm working on anything, I'm typically focused on, right, on conceptual layering and also physical layering, right? How to build up the concepts and bridge them in a way that makes sense for the concept, but also how to layer physically or visually. I'm a huge fan of digital and analog approaches because in terms of experimentation, I think that, right, working entirely digitally is too perfect and too clean. And there's far more opportunity for mistakes and missteps when you are working with physical forms. So then you can work backwards and forwards and make something digitally and then create it as a physical object and then translate that back to digitally. I think there's a lot of opportunity for experimentation, right? Because in a lot of ways, when you start working, translating something back and forth, right, something's going to be lost digitally. And you might not be expecting for something to work a certain way, but then at the same time, you can look at it and go, actually, that's not what I was shooting for, but that's pretty cool. I think in terms of experimentation, that's something that you have to be open to. And so these examples are pieces that I made specifically for Instagram. They were a direct response to the ever more obvious and ever more visual, uh, overly violent responses by police, and also the uprisings as of late. And in terms of experimentation, the background that you see is the sheet of notes that I was writing this idea and this concept down on. Right. So I decided to, right, one, write down the basics of what I was trying to say, but then I was also writing down what this piece could potentially look like. And I think that it's kind of interesting to take, it's almost like a meta synthesis when you're using the material that you use to record an idea or a thought inside of the piece. Like that's one of the things that I find interesting about like physical and conceptual layering. And in terms of, right, experimentation, especially if you're working on self-initiated projects or personal projects, as I was saying before, if you are developing your perspective, right, figuring out what inspires you, figuring out what you care about, you're going to have to become very familiar with the fact that these might not be popular opinions. These might not resonate with anyone, right? But if you're experimenting, you're doing that for specific reasons, right? Whether that's figuring out what to do in terms of your work, looking for a direction, trying to practice, right? Putting it out there into the world, your work's not always going to be loved by everyone. And as makers, I feel like that's something that it's a necessity for us to become familiar with that and become comfortable with it. One of the things that I think is important in terms of making work, one of the things that is important to me and it's part of my perspective is responding, right? To contemporary issues, contemporary values. I think that if we are using visual communication for anything, and it's not to respond to the world that we're in, then I think it's going to be very difficult to continue to make work, right? Like if you are constantly responding to something from the past, right, that is inherently going to make your work irrelevant, right? Not that you have to be, trying to keep up with, all the, biggest firms and whatever, but as a maker that lives in this world, right, you're present when anything and everything is happening, and these things are inherently going to affect you, right? And as visual communicators, it's like we are the ones that, fortunately or unfortunately, have the ability to respond to these things and touch other people. How you want to do that is entirely up to you. That was more focused on, right, like the experimentation of life as a maker in contemporary society, which conceptually is the same thing as experimenting in a technical sense or experimenting with your concepts. All right, so now we're going to touch on the delicate topics of perfection and failure. All right, so everyone would probably define one of these things as good and one of these things as bad. I'm going to say that that idea is flipped. All right, this pursuit of perfection and perfectionism is oftentimes the thing that is holding people back from being able to try and being able to begin thinking about something that is maybe not going to be successful, maybe not going to work, maybe not going to communicate in the way that you want it to. Right? That's part of that risk is part of what is important, right? Especially if you are making work and intending to make work, right? The thing that we should be embracing because that is where we have all of the opportunity to do and try. Right? So I'm just going to, I know this isn't going to be applicable for, many different scenarios and many different contexts, right? If you are working for a client, working for a firm, working for an agency, yes, perhaps you don't have the same freedom to be able to take risks, to be able to, try whatever you want. Typically, you're going to be working in a very specific direction, right? And failure is definitely not something that you or your art director or creative director are going to be trying to embrace. So for the purposes of this talk, we'll just keep it personal and talk about all of this in terms of um, personal practice, right? Because that's where you can give yourself the freedom to experiment, the freedom to fail. You can give yourself or create the bar for what perfect, what finished, or what complete is. I, these next couple pieces are from a series of screen prints that I did. And the ones that I'm showing you are all of the imperfect ones. These are the ones that were test prints that were not at all intended to turn out this way. Right? And when we're talking about experimentation, part of what we're talking about is accepting that something can be beautiful or interesting, even though that is not what you were shooting for. Just because something doesn't turn out the way that you wanted it to, that does not mean that it's a mistake, and that does not mean that it's a failure. right? If you are working in this way, in this process, where you're able to stop and look at something and evaluate it not for what you were trying to make, but evaluate it for the thing that it is, then that gives you the space to say, okay, I didn't exactly get where I was going, but I think this is pretty good. I think that a lot of us get hung up on starting with an idea, starting with a concept, working through the process. And if we don't end up exactly where we intended to end up, then we view that as a failure and go all the way back to the beginning. Right? But there are so many opportunities in the middle of this process, right, where any one of these ideas, iterations, or concepts, even though that's not where you were trying to get, they might be good for other reasons. And so the next three are a collection of the screen prints that I made maybe a couple of years ago. I'm a huge fan of uh, photography, 35mm photography. I've got a couple of Polaroid cameras. So this is a screen print of a Polaroid. But the photo that I was trying to take with the Polaroid camera did not turn out the way that I wanted to. It didn't turn out at all. So I was stuck with this question of, so what do I do with this, ridiculously useless Polaroid? Uh, so the obvious answer is to experiment with the material aspects of it. I took an X-Acto and I started taking it apart. I'm pretty sure that I probably set these on fire. Um, but after that, I started to look at it and evaluate the physical object for what it was. And I was thinking to myself, I mean, these are actually pretty cool in terms of the texture of the thing, right? Like, it's not an image in a place where you would ordinarily see one, right? Most of us know what a Polaroid frame looks like. So it's actually oddly bizarre to be able to look in the frame and not see an identifiable image, but instead see a texture that looks almost organic. So then the next layer of experimentation with this was saying to myself, okay, well, I know what this looks like in its natural scale, but what happens if I blow this thing up to 18 by 24? Right? In working through this process, I started to become fascinated by the fact that you could take something that is an object generated by humans, and it starts to look uh, topographic, biological, like a landscape of some sort. And once again, this is not at all what I was shooting for. This is something that came out of the process and came out of asking what if. And in our work and in our process, another huge part of it is, even if you are not using something for its intended purpose, what else can it be? Right? What else can it do? What else can it say? Because even if something isn't saying what we intended for it to say, it's saying something. So technical skills, sure. Um, so I would not say that I am technically proficient in many of the things that I pursue creatively. I don't think that I would call myself a photographer, even though it is something that I like to do. And I'd say maybe I'm pretty good at it. To me, that's not the important part. Right? The important part is experimenting with a format and a direction that I find interesting. Right? I wouldn't say that I'm technically proficient in the After Effects. Right? I was uh, in school at a time when After Effects didn't exist, and the the web didn't really exist. So when I look around at things that I'm interested in, the idea of technical skill is not as important to me as my pursuit of something that I think is interesting. And in some of my classes, my students often complain that they can't do something or can't pursue an idea that they think is cool because nobody ever taught them how to do that. I'm like, yes, I get it. That can be frustrating. But at the same time, this is the 21st century. I guarantee you, in 10 years, there's going to be software and technology that nobody has taught us about. And if you want to use it, it's very important that you, right, don't intimidate yourself out of trying something, right? Like if you want to do something, I mean, what's the worst that can happen? You make something that's not successful, right? Like once again, this goes back to the bar of if you're experimenting, if you're creating and you are doing this on your own, like you set the bar for what is successful. This is a quick demo that I did for my students, trying to get them to question what a specimen sheet is. I think that as designers, most of us probably know what a specimen sheet is and what it looks like. My question is, right, what else can you do with it? What else can it be? What else can you try? Like, this was inspired by the idea, what happens if you make a specimen sheet move, right? And I was working very quickly on this demo with what I had in class. So I was using the camera on my smartphone and I made a animation in Photoshop that I exported as a GIF. I reduced the frame rate just to make it a little bit more choppy, right? But I mean, the idea is that try something just, because it's like, why not? It's like, what's stopping you? It's like, what's stopping you from taking bits of rejected specimen sheets and chopping those up and making a, short, silent French film out of them? Right, so technical skills. Right, these next three are pieces that I made in After Effects. These are not things that I was ever taught. But these all come from like my interest in experimenting with, right, things that I would ordinarily make static, like what happens if you apply time, right? Or what happens when you take visual language or a sentence and you start applying feeling to them via motion and via time. And like I like to view these in experiments in how a sentence is read. Right, because the type itself is already going to have specific character, right? But when you take the letters and the letter forms, like what happens if you start to create something clear that is supposed to be communicating clearly, and you add an element of, what's the right word? Feeling or emotion? So the idea that I was experimenting with these was trying to incorporate a feeling of frustration or paranoia with the 21st century. Right? And once again, working on personal projects, is this complete? Is the experiment successful? I don't know. I have no idea. But I got to a place where I stopped and I said, okay, that's pretty good. Right? And in the process, one of the other important aspects to me was that I was learning more about a program that I was trying to teach myself. Right? So even the end goal isn't really the end goal. It's like the process and the experimentation is also research. And so going back to this conversation about my interest in photography, right? That extends to my interest in videography. And the next two pieces are from a collection that I call Selection, right? And these are about experimenting with the idea of fragmented narratives, right? Like looking at social media and the ads on social media, like we've seen that those are like what, 3 to 5 seconds, right? So this would be like a really short version of a movie trailer and trying to experiment with the idea of getting the communication of what the story is about to the viewer in as short a time as possible. Right? And in terms of experimenting with the layering, the image in the background is a 35 millimeter photograph. And then the image on top is video from taken with my smartphone. Right? Curiosity plus action, right? Because this idea of experimentation and asking questions does not do you any good if you are not adding action to those, right? It isn't good enough to just ask the questions, right? You actually have to really do something. Even if you think that it's going to be a failure, even if you don't think that you have the technical skill to accomplish it, even if you don't think anybody's going to be into it. Like, these are not things that you can concern yourself with, right? These are the things that, going back to this idea of perfection and failure, are going to stop you from experimenting. Right? These 3 posters are based on the question of what happens if I make a poster and then apply time to that poster? Does it change the meaning? Does it obliterate it? Does it alter it? These are questions and curiosities that I was thinking about. Right? In the same way that I was talking about adjusting verbal language or sentence structure, right? It's like, what happens if you take a sentence or a sentence fragment and you introduce the words backwards? Right? Does it change the meaning? Does it make it contradictory? Does it make it more impactful? Once again, I'm more of a fan of asking questions and answering questions with questions. So by no means should you think that I'm trying to answer the questions that I'm asking right now. I mean, if you have answers, you can let me know. Right, with this one, I was focused on the idea of the impact of the hard stop of a question mark, right? And letting that be the beginning of the sentence as opposed to the end. Right? If you're shifting the way that people see the message or when they see the message, right? Does that change their assumption about where it's going and what it's saying? All right, did someone else do it? Chances are the answer is probably yes. But what I'm going to say is that it doesn't matter. in terms of experimentation, trying to figure out how to make the most original, the most dynamic thing in the world, like that's another one of the ideas of perfection that's going to get in your way of curiosity and action, right? Whether somebody else did something or not is not important, right? This goes back to the idea of inspiration in your perspective, right? That's what you should be focusing on, not what other people are doing, right? Yes, you can use, right, work from other people as, reference, as inspiration. But if you're situating yourself in a position where you're trying to work around everything that's ever been made, you're going to have a very difficult time pursuing creative ideas. Right? And then I'm going to get really contradictory with it and say that if somebody else has done it, then that by definition means that you can do it. Right? So if it's been done, if somebody else did it, you can too. Right? Is there anything wrong with looking at other people's work and trying to figure out how they did it, how the concept works, how they developed this idea technically? No. If somebody else did it, then you do it. Right? And then based on what you've learned and based on that experimentation, you can apply that to your own concepts and your own ideas. Right? Like, has somebody ever made a motion graphics piece with, video in the background and a text overlay? I'm pretty sure they have. But that has nothing to do with the fact that this is an idea that I wanted to teach myself technically and learn how to do it, right? So, oh, sorry, just one more thing about this piece. So I've got an odd sense of humor. So way back at the beginning of the shutdown due to COVID, these were pieces that I made as humorous inspiration as a response to the shutdown. Right, so in terms of experimentation, if someone else did it, yes, you can do it and you should. Right? In terms of figuring out who you are, what you're inspired by, right? Like what technical skills are, it's like all of these things are going to come together really well. Probably not immediately, but they will, right? Don't be scared to try something and fail. Don't be scared to try and continuously fail. Don't be scared to experiment with something and put it out there and have somebody go, what? I don't get it. It's like, this isn't about other people. Experimentation is about who you are, who you want to be, and what you want to do as a maker. So thank you very much, y'all. I think I went fantastically over my time.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, and me being a fan of your work, getting the opportunity to hear you speak about it was a very pleasant experience for me.
Thank you.
There are a few questions in the chat, so I'm just gonna go through some of them really quick.
Okay.
Someone had a question around like how do you go about encouraging like your students like to read? Is there anything that you do to inspire them in that regard?
Yes. Well, first, I mean, well, an important part of my teaching practice is developing, right, community and developing relationships. So I typically start with trying to find out who they are and what they're into. And then I would start like with smaller pieces, right? Like individual essays, chapters. Like I would lend them, books from my own collection. Or if I'm reading something, like I'll bring it up in class and just talk about it, uh, and try to expose them to like different areas and different ideas, because sometimes you don't know what you're interested in or what topics you're into until you're exposed to them.
Okay. And then for anyone else that has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and you could go ahead and speak. Something that you mentioned that really spoke to me was the idea of your design's not always being directly influenced by other design. And I think that's something that's incredibly important because in a sense, the entire world is design. So like even for myself, like I've noticed that I get the most inspiration when I'm looking at things that aren't necessarily graphic design pieces. So
Mhm.
hearing that come from you was assuring.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that, well, especially in design education, that's a little bit tricky because it's like you need to read about graphic design, right? Like you need these like theories, you need the history, you need the essays, but at the same time, it's like you have to, right, like be trying to inspire the idea that, you know, design isn't for design's sake, right? So how do you, or like inspire designers, or as designers, how do we, as right, like our own creative like bosses, keep our minds and keep reaching out for all of these things that we should be learning about the world, right? Like politics, like whatever, so that we're capable of designing for a world that isn't designed. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
Yeah. Someone else asked about how you found yourself in a position to be teaching design. What led you to it?
You know, I always wanted to teach. I wanted to be an educator. When I finished my master's degree in 2008, I did not think that I was going to be getting into it as quickly. I think I probably started teaching 4 years later, because I was not able to find a design job. So like in my head, like when I graduated grad school, I was like, cool. So I'm just gonna like get out here. I'm gonna have a successful design career for a couple, you know, decades, and then, you know, I'll jump into teaching and become a professor. You know, that is not what happened at all. So I don't know. I feel like I was always going to end up a teacher or design educator. Um, I think that I just ended up here more quickly, but I also think that that is, you know, beneficial for myself and my students. I think it kind of helps because I'm more, I don't know, I think I'm more easily able to build community with them.
Mhm. Someone else asked, what draws you to teaching? How does it influence your other practices?
I mean, teaching's great. I mean, if any of y'all are like on the fence about it or have questions about it, you should absolutely do it. You get paid to talk about what you love all the time, and your practice is inherently a part of it because you're doing demos and making things, teaching other people how to do it. So you're talking about your creative practice and you're also making things all the time. It's pretty awesome. Um, and at the same time, like, so it influences my other practices because it's like when you are teaching other people and helping other people to understand and be inspired, right? You are automatically processing all of these things in your own mind, right? So you are, right, like, well, one, strengthening your own knowledge in a very like consistent way, because when you have to explain, right, the same types of ideas like repeatedly, It's like you will become far more familiar with your own thoughts and your own understandings than you thought you could. Right. And then at the same time, it's like with everything that you are making, it's like having a constant reason to engage in your creative thoughts and your creative practice. Yeah, it's great.
And then something else that really stood out that you said that I've personally been, as of recently, trying to do more is accepting the fact that there's just questions that we don't know the answer to, and it's not always about, getting an answer. So could you speak more about just you briefly mentioned like not knowing. Curious about, you could expand more upon that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, questions are a lot more interesting than answers because that means that there's always potential, right? And in a question and in questioning, like there are billions of, opportunities, right? Once you have an answer, it's like that's it. That's the one thing, right? So even if you are right engaging in questions, trying to figure out what other questions make this make sense, I think that that provides opportunity, right? Not just in terms of visual communication, but also in the development of thought, right? Because a huge part of our practice is based on developing concepts, right? And that's based on very intense cognitive activity, right? Like that's going to mean that if you're not constantly asking questions, then you're focusing on the answer to something, right? If you're focusing on the one answer to something, how many other things are you not, questioning or pursuing or being curious about?
I have a question, actually. Um, I would love to know two things, actually. I was wondering if you ever experimented with printmaking, and if so, how was that for you? Because some of your work looked like prints. And
Mhm.
number two, what's your favorite book?
All right, first question. Yes, screen printing has become a really important part of my art practice in the past couple of years. Um, Sadly, being trapped in the house, I haven't been able to print anything for the past couple months. But yeah, I think that screen printing is great because it's in the way that I like to work with both analog and digital techniques. It's one of the techniques that I like because it's physical, but it also requires like almost digital precision. So, and I also think it's really fun to um, like play with scale, the same way that I was doing with the Polaroid pieces, right? Taking a physical object and then screen printing it at like a scale that is, you know, ridiculously like bizarre and abstract. Like I think that like screen printing is a great medium for translating something into something else and then trying to figure out how that like image makes sense or how it doesn't. I'm gonna have a really hard time answering the my favorite book. Um, Off the top of my head, so that uh, I don't have to, get up and wander around and ponder this for a minute. So in nonfiction, I would say pretty much anything Rebecca Solnit has done. And then in fiction, I would say work by Jeff Vandermeer and V.E. Schwab.
Okay, I haven't read any of those yet, so
Oh, you should.
thank you.
Mhm.
So I know we're almost at time. Let me see if there's any questions here that could. Let's see. There's one question that I'm also curious about. Someone asked about since your work is very much about experimenting. At what point, like, what are some indicators that let you know that an experiment is now done, and you could like move on?
Done. That's a good question, right? Like I'll set like limits for myself in a couple of different ways. Like recently I was working on a project and I wanted to get it done in between the class I was teaching in the morning and the class I was teaching in the afternoon, right? So that was my deadline. I was like, well, class starts at 2, so I'm gonna have this done by 2, right? So regardless of like where it was, at 2 o'clock, it was done. I would say that like otherwise, intuition is like a huge part of determining when something is finished, right? Because, right, like even if I'm making something and it doesn't look anything like what I wanted it to look like when I started it, if I look at something and go, you know what? I don't know how I made that or how I got here, but all right, I'm into it. It's like that for me is a bar, right? Like if I'm experimenting on personal projects, that's, you know, whatever you determine it to be.
We're almost at time, and I want to be mindful of everyone's schedule. Just before we head out, I just want to thank you, Jonathan, so much for your very amazing talk that you just gave. We did record everything, so we'll be uploading that somewhere sometime soon for anyone to go back and rewatch it if needed. But with that said, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone else, for joining. This was great. Very happy to have so many people here and all that.
Can I say really quickly? Yeah, Christian and Angela talked about this, and I just wanted to reiterate to everyone. I believe somewhere in here is my contact info, website, Instagram. Please get in touch if you have other questions that didn't get to answer, want to talk about, or if you just want to chat. You can email me, get in touch. I'm not hard to find. My website has my phone number if you want to text or whatever. But yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, like, please, if you need something or feel like I can be a resource or your feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out.
I'm definitely going to take you up on that.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you.
Sweet.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you all so much.
Stay safe.
Everyone.
Christian, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Bye.
See ya.